My name is Kate Germond. I'm the executive director of Centurion, founded in 1983 as the first organization to work on behalf of wrongly convicted people. To date, we have freed 60 people from their life and death sentences across the United States and Canada. We bear all costs connected to exonerating the wrongly convicted, and we primarily are field investigation work. This is frustrating work, especially because prosecutors fight us every single step of the way, including once we've won a reversal of a conviction. In fact, just this past Monday, we won a reversal of a conviction in a DNA case, and we asked for bail, and it was granted. That's on Monday. Tuesday, the prosecutor appealed our bail motion to the appellate division, and by Wednesday, they had won. And that meant that the man who had no prior criminal record, who had spent 23 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, who had family waiting for him, has to stay in the Passaic County Jail until God knows when we can have justice prevail again for him. This work is heartbreaking and at times just plain wrong. Our stories of our wrongly convicted people should be seen as a cautionary tale. It could happen to anyone, and make no mistake about it, in this country you get the justice you can afford. Blind focus by police means that the police and prosecutors have their finger on the scale. Common sense goes out the window, and innocent people are wrongly convicted and spend decades in prison. This is heartbreaking work and often takes years to have a result. Let me tell you about Ed Honaker. In 1983, Ed, who had no prior criminal record and never should have been in a mugshot book, was identified by a victim of a sexual assault as her perpetrator, along with her boyfriend who had been present when she was abducted. Ed told me that in his trial, when he listened to the victim testify, he began to doubt his own innocence because of the vehemence of her testimony. Ed became a suspect in this case because a neighbor of his several years earlier had been sexually assaulted, and when questioned by police, she told them that her assailant resembled her neighbor. He was not her neighbor, but he resembled her neighbor, and so the police went and talked to him. They did check out his alibi, which was he was at an office party and that was supported by a number of the other people that he worked with. And then the police in their investigation asked Ed if he would allow them to take his picture so that they could use that in their investigation of his neighbor's sexual assault. Ed agreed to do this, and little knowing that several years later, in a neighboring county several hundred miles away, this young woman would be sexually assaulted and raped, and she would pick his photograph out of a mugshot book because his photograph had been sent to the neighboring county as a potential suspect, despite the fact that he never should have been involved in this case at all. We knew Ed was innocent because the victim's rape kit showed that she had spermatozoa, and Ed had had a vasectomy, which meant he couldn't produce sperm, and his attorney, who was way out of his depth, did not realize the significance of this. So when we took on the case, we decided this was going to be a DNA case, and we got the physical evidence, had it sent to a DNA lab. The results came back that he was exonerated. And that should have been the end of it, except that this was Virginia. And Virginia has this thing called the 60-day rule, which means that when you're convicted of a crime, you have 60 days to get back into court with newly discovered evidence. And we were way outside that 60 days. And so that meant we had to go through the governor. And the governor in this case had ridden into office on a law and order platform, and he was currently up for re-election and was still running on that platform. And he determined that the spermatozoa found in the victim's rape kit was from consensual sex with her boyfriend 3 days earlier, which is ridiculous. So now we have a new wrinkle, and I now need to get the boyfriend to give me a buccal swab so we can have it DNA tested, so we can get him excluded, so we can get Ed exonerated. Only the problem is among other things, is that the result of the sexual assault was it created an irreparable breach in their relationship, and they had separated, and he was extremely disappointed about that and extremely hostile towards me, asking him to help me with this case. So what I decided to do was I would continue to work on getting him to give me a buccal swab while investigating the case. The sexual assault had occurred on federal park lands where the couple had been camping when she was abducted. I knew that there was a park ranger station fairly nearby, so I had decided they were probably the first people to interview the victim and her boyfriend. And so I had started this investigation actually in the winter, and the ranger station was on top of a high mountain pass, so I had to wait until the snows melted before I could head up there, which I did, meanwhile bugging the boyfriend for a buccal swab in between. And when I got up there, I explained my mission to the park rangers, and they quickly reached into a file cabinet, produced the report that had been generated on the day of the crime, and indeed they were the first people to interview the victim and her boyfriend. And in the report, the victim described her assailant, to my great surprise, as well over 6 feet tall and imposing. Ed was maybe 5'8" and slight at that time. But even more astonishingly, she said that she never saw the face of her assailant, and nor had the boyfriend. I then went to the courthouse to look through his file just to see what might be in there. And to, again, my great surprise, in there was a letter from a hypnotist requesting payment for a bill that had been not satisfied at the time of the trial. And in it, he wrote a letter describing exactly what he had done that merited being paid for. And in the letter, he said that a sheriff had brought a young woman and her boyfriend to his office to have them hypnotized. She had been a victim of a sexual assault, and the boyfriend had encountered the assailant, and that the sheriff needed them to help him make an ID of who the assailant was. Now, the reality is your brain is not a camera that accurately records things that you can then recall at either will or through hypnosis, and you certainly can't recall a face you've never seen. I knew the hypnotist's letter was a Brady violation, but I wanted Ed to be exonerated and not freed on a technicality, so I continued to pursue getting a buccal from the boyfriend. And in conversations with the then prosecutor, I talked to him about this, and he was also increasingly frustrated because he thought that it was kind of unreasonable that the governor's theory of why it would be the boyfriend. So he reached out to the boyfriend with me, and we eventually got the buccal, and Ed was, and the boyfriend was excluded too, and now the governor came up with a new theory of the case, which was the girlfriend had secret boyfriends on the side, and he was pressuring her to come up with people. And at that point, the director of the Virginia Crime Lab had enough of this nonsense, and he publicly said, Ed Honaker has been excluded, he is an innocent man, he should be freed. And with that pressure, the governor finally acquiesced, and Ed was freed and exonerated in 1994. I also want to tell you about James Waller. His story is equally as interesting and frustrating, but his is really an example of the capriciousness of the criminal justice system. But more importantly, it's also about the unbelievable and inconceivable optimism and faith of our exonerees. If you ever meet them, you'll be blown away. In 1982, in Dallas, Texas, a 7-year-old white child was raped in his bedroom while his parents were at work in the early morning hours, and the sexual assault was by a black male. The boy reported to police that he had a tiny glimpse of the assailant when he peeked out from under the pillow that the assailant had placed on his head. The crime went unsolved for a while until the child saw James Waller in a grocery store several weeks later. James Waller is a very tall man, no prior criminal record. He was a student at a university in Dallas. And on the day the child made the identification, he was wearing a bright red cowboy hat. We think that that's probably what caught the child's attention. James had an alibi. However, in our work and in wrongful convictions, eyewitness identification is often the strongest determinant in wrongful convictions. I worked James' case up and anticipated on taking it as a DNA case, and I sent him a letter, as we usually do, to tell him that I'm headed to Texas to visit him. And a couple of weeks later, the letter came back saying that he had been discharged from the prison, which I thought was kind of unusual given the nature of his crime. And then several years passed, and James called the office seeking our help because he had gotten married, and he and his wife wanted to have a child, and under Megan's law, they wouldn't be able to have their child be around other children. He couldn't take his kid to school, and on and on. Megan's law is a very restrictive post-conviction law for people who've been convicted of sexual offenses. We readily agreed we would help James, and we found him a lawyer, and we located the physical evidence, but the only thing that was left was an anal slide that has some fecal matter on it, which would potentially contaminate the proteins that should contain the evidence of whoever was the perpetrator. And as we were negotiating with the DA to get the work done at a boutique DNA lab, because this was going to need somebody to take really good care of how they handled the evidence, the Dallas DA, or the Dallas Crime Lab, went ahead and tested the physical evidence, and in the process destroyed all the evidence on the slide, and they never got a result. So I called James to tell him this, and naturally he was extremely disappointed. But what he said to me was, "Kate, don't worry about me, God's going to make DNA." And I thought, well, that's about what it's going to take. And over the next bunch of years, James would call me every year right around Thanksgiving time just to catch up and telling me how things were going. And at the end of every single phone call, he said, "Kate, don't worry about me, God's going to make DNA." And then one year he called, and I just couldn't answer the phone. I was so crushed that we weren't able to help James. And it took me a couple of weeks to finally listen to his message, and he was sobbing. And so I immediately called him up, and he told me that he and his wife, on faith, had gotten pregnant. And to celebrate this pregnancy, her family was coming to celebrate Thanksgiving with them. And she had driven to the airport to go collect them. And on her way to the airport, somebody hit her, and she and their unborn child died. And through his tears, he said to me, "Kate, don't worry about me, God's going to make DNA." And the phone calls continued until December of 2007, when I got a phone call from Nina Morrison, who's an attorney at the New York Innocence Project and a good friend. And she called to tell me that James had reached out to her as well, asking her if she could help him get exonerated. She called up the Dallas DA's office and the crime lab and discovered that they had some extracts. And she had the extracts sent to a really good DNA lab, and James came back exonerated. Now, to backtrack, I knew about extracts in the late 90s when the slide was tested. But I was so gutted by the recklessness of the Dallas DA's crime lab, or the Dallas Crime Lab, that I completely forgot about it. And thank goodness I had, because I'm an extremely stubborn woman. And if we had tested those extracts back then, that tiny minute of evidence, we never would have gotten a result in 1998. But by 2007, DNA testing was sophisticated enough and discriminating enough to get a result on that minute amount of evidence. God had indeed made DNA. And I just want to leave you with one last thing. Scholarly studies suggest that between 2 and 5% of 2 million incarcerated persons in America are wrongly convicted. Even taking the lowest estimate, that's 40,000 people, innocent people who are staring out at us from behind prison bars, asking for our intervention. And this is the work we've been called to do. Thank you.